So hello, Austin. It's good to have you here at GameOn. It was really nice to see you at the GameOn live concert, to give that the Journey soundtrack. And now I have a few questions for you.
Sure.
And first is how and when you started composing the music?
For Journey? Or you mean just in general?
In general.
Okay. So, music was never a part of my life as a young kid at all. I didn't listen to albums. If you had said, what's your favorite band? I would have said, what's a band? It was just not part of my world. And then around age 10, I loved movies and I loved video games. And we had an old piano that no one was playing anymore. So I started to realize I could kind of hit the keys and figure out melodies from like Star Wars and the movies that I loved. So my parents said, why don't you try piano lessons? And I said, you know what? Okay, let's try it. And so my piano teacher said, what do you want to learn? And I like classical music, jazz, what are you interested in? And I said, I have no idea. I don't really know anything about music. I just know that this is kind of fun. And he said, well, let me play you my favorite music. And he brought records the next week of Jerry Goldsmith film scores. Jerry Goldsmith, the composer of movies like Star Trek, the original Star Trek the Motion Picture, Alien, the original Planet of the Apes, more recent, he died in 2004, had a very long career, 50 years, did Disney films like Mulan, he did LA Confidential, just lots and lots, Total Recall, another classic, and I was captivated. I said, that's what I want to do. I can't believe that there are composers that do nothing but write music and that they do it for films and television and classical symphony orchestras, and they write operas I had no idea any of that existed. So I said, that's what I want to do. So from age 10, it became my obsession, and my whole life was about achieving that from that point forward. And I'm very, very lucky that I've somehow managed to actually have a career, especially in video games, because I'm such a passionate gamer that the collision of my work with one of my great loves is just a dream.
Because you now mentioned you're a passionate gamer, I'll ask this question now. What do you play yourself?
I honestly like all different kinds of games. I've been really busy this last year, so I'm way behind on new releases. I did play Mass Effect Andromeda start to finish. I was a bit disappointed in it, but I was not going to let it pass me by because the Mass Effect series is one of my favorite sort of trilogies of games of my whole life. And I don't consider myself a hardcore RPG guy. For example, I mean, like growing up, when I think in high school is when Final Fantasy VII came out, or maybe it was slightly before that. And it's like, still to this day considered one of the greatest RPGs of all time. And I never could quite get into it, but I love Fallout 3 and 4, the whole Fallout series, but especially 3 and 4. Massive love for those. So RPG's okay, but strategy games also has tended to be, like, I'm a big sucker for this recent XCOM reboots, and the recent one, the recent sort of DLC War of the Chosen that came out like a week ago is excellent. So, but, having worked on a game like Journey and others, and Abzu and other games that are in a similar sort of vein, I really have fallen in love with that kind of thing as well. So my friends at the developer based in London, or in Brighton in England, called the Chinese Room, that made Everybody's Gone to the Rapture and Dear Esther two of my absolute favorite games. And they're both in that similar vein to Journey, or probably more accurately, Journey is in a similar vein to them, of an introspective, contemplative kind of experience without a lot of the traditional game mechanics. I love that. I love games as poetry. So it's you name it, it's probably, I'm interested.
Okay, and returning to music, which artists do you listen? Which music you listen? And what inspires you most?
Well, I look for inspiration outside of music. Like the event here today, this speed painting with this incredible painter, Angela Bermudez. She and I work together on a lot of projects where I'll say a description of something to her, and she'll go paint something, and then I try to write music inspired by her painting. So it's like the idea passes through the filter of her before I let it come back to me. And I've really been enjoying that kind of process, because to me, being inspired directly by other music too often leads to just composers trying to emulate that other music. And I'm not interested in that. I'm always trying to dig and find something new, something fresh.
And as I know, you compose not only for video games, but for films also, yes? How it differs, composing for video games and for the films?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, they have the most important thing in common of they both want to tell a good story most of the time. I mean, games, I would say that even non-narrative games are still trying to tell a story. It's just the player's story. Like Tetris doesn't have a storyline, but your experience is a kind of narrative. That the rise and fall of the drama of almost failing and then succeeding or being utterly, ruined or whatever. And esports are no different, et cetera, et cetera. So all games, I think, boil down to some kind of storytelling, and so does film. And so your job as a composer is the same in both. You're there to support telling a good story, and there's a million different ways to break that down and to go into further depth, but the key is to, I think, honor the fact that you're a storyteller. That said, video games are interactive and films are not, and so that separates them in a way that is massive. And we're still at the beginning stages of even figuring out what that means. I mean, the industry of games is a couple decades old, basically. Film is 100 years old or more. And so we're in the equivalent of where movies were in like the 1930s, where they made King Kong, they made the Wizard of Oz, and, in that same basic time period, Casablanca, and a little after that, movies like Citizen Kane, which are still to this day considered masterpieces of cinema. But movies are also much, later we had like Jaws and E.T. and Star Wars and things like that. There was a lot of room to grow. Games, I think, still has all of its best future ahead of it. We're at the baby steps currently.
Okay, and speaking of journey, one of your better known soundtracks, it was the first video game soundtrack nominated for Grammy. How does it felt?
I mean, it was surreal. It was surreal then, it's surreal now. I mean, it was not expected. And it's strange because video games have been eligible for a Grammy since 1999. And it was like 7-8 years that none was ever nominated. And none has been nominated since. And I think that's a shame, because Journey might have been the first, but it doesn't necessarily deserve to have been the first. Because before Journey was BioShock, for example. BioShock, I think, is one of the great games and game scores of all time. I mean, it took shooters to a new level of emotional and intellectual depth, both in the gameplay and in the music. And that should have been nominated for a Grammy, as far as I'm concerned. And then even, like Halo and things like that. I mean, these are massively, universal appeals. So I'm very honored that I had this happen to me. But it's surreal because I don't wake up thinking, yeah, I deserve that. I kind of think, really? But it's an enormous honor.
Could you describe your day as a video game composer?
Well, I actually try to make every day different, because I don't want to get into like a rut of doing the same thing over and over, because then I'll end up writing the same music over and over. So some days I get up really early, like 4:30, 5 in the morning, and I start composing immediately. And then other days I get up at 7 or 8, have coffee, answer some emails, talk on the phone, and I don't start writing music till noon or 1. Some days I play test the games I'm working on a lot. So sometimes I'll sit and I'll just play the game for an hour while I have coffee or whatever in the morning, and and then I start writing. And I mean, sometimes I don't even start writing until 7 or 8 in the evening, and I'll go until 1 in the morning or whatever the case. So I actually don't, sorry to not really answer your question, I guess, but I don't really have a typical day. I kind of intentionally avoid that. In fact, I don't work from home. I have a studio, and I don't even like to drive to it the same way each day. I like to take different routes just for the same reason, to kind of mix it up.
So you can say, when there is a spark, you compose.
Yeah, and sometimes you have to kind of create the spark, but I like to just vary, because there's always a lot of different things to do, so it's kind of like I'm reshuffling the order in which I do them. You know, like sometimes I'll start by playtesting and then I'll compose, sometimes I'll compose, then I'll playtest, that kind of thing. So it's not so much that romantic image of a composer like sitting by a river and saying, what shall I do, and waiting until inspiration strikes. I have a job to do and I sit down and do it. It's just when during the day I do it, it varies a lot.
Okay, and what is the biggest challenges of composing for a video game? Could you name it?
Well, for me, the biggest challenge is also the biggest excitement, which is that interactive component I talked about. Because music is, I before mentioned how games are a form of storytelling, so is music. Music unfolds like drama, and sometimes it's very still the whole time, like looking at a photo of a lake in the winter, you know, where it's like glass. And then others, it's like a battle where it's full of activity and passion and rage and all these other emotions. And everywhere in between. And sometimes it has huge highs and lows that go back and forth and up and down all the time. And then it's other times very narrow, like an earthquake seismograph, you know, that's doing this. And so the key with video games is that the player is having this experience that traces along this dramatic curve. The more the interactive music, the more I have to be able to follow this with them. Now, I'm not playing the game with them by the time I finish the score, so I don't know what they're going to do. Especially if it's, you know, a game like I worked on, Assassin's Creed Syndicate, for example. That's an open world kind of game, so the indeterminacy of what a player will do in advance is massive. I don't know if they're going to spend 20 hours just looking for treasures, or if they're going to get into as many fights as they can, or whatever. It's like, or just follow the storyline. It's impossible to say. So as they create this arc of their experience up and down, the music is almost like a toolkit that has to be ready to take itself apart and put itself back together around the experience they're having. The trouble with that is that storytelling takes place over time, which means it's linear. Point A, point B, point C. Always in that order, right? Well, if I don't know if A is going to come first or B or C, how do I make a story without it just feeling like random crap? That is a challenge. And the answer is, we don't know. We're still learning. It's an art form that is developing very much still. So the degree to which you play the music out and just try to nail an emotion versus try to make it, you know, like this toolkit as I described, that's the biggest challenge. But it has the biggest reward, because a game like Journey, I was able to get so tight that players felt like the music was this wizard that knew what they were going to do. And that's because I spent 3 years on a 90-minute game trying to think of every single possible thing a player could do and write music to account for that. But it's not possible on a game like Assassin's Creed that has 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 hours of gameplay. So it's a huge challenge, but it's the best. That's what makes it such a fun and wonderful art form to be a part of.
Okay, and for now, currently, what is your dream project? Who would you work with? If you can choose anybody you like.
You know, it's hard to say, because I've already worked with a few of my dream collaborators. I mean, for example, Double Fine, Tim Schafer. He was sort of the driving force behind most of my favorite games growing up. And so when he and his studio called me to work with them a few years ago, I couldn't believe it. And it was a small title, but it was an amazing experience. And you know, I was a big fan of Assassin's Creed, and so when I got that call, it also was sort of, it already checked that box. So my answer now is, honestly, it's someone my dream is someone who's making something that's, you know, the same way that Journey and Flow were, where until I saw it, I could never have imagined it. So the answer is, I don't know. It's someone out there is making something that I have never imagined before, and hopefully our paths can cross and I can work on that, because the experience of growth that came from working on Journey in particular was so enormous. I grew as a human being. I was a more mature person by the time we were done than at the beginning, because of working on that game. And so those are the dream collaborators. And that can come from anywhere. It can come from a major studio, you know, an EA or a Sony or Microsoft, Ubisoft, whatever. or small independent developers. I mean, like Pocket Watch Games, is a developer I worked with on a game that just came out this week called Tooth and Tail. It's only half a dozen people, and our last game was like 3 people, and it was an incredibly rewarding experience. So, and I never knew them until I knew them, and that's who I want. So it's a big question mark.
And for final question, I got really tough question. Name one your project you're most proudly of.
It's impossible, honestly, because the goal with each project is to push myself somewhere I've never been. And I have been very lucky in my career that I've been able to have most every project I've worked on satisfy that on some level, where I'm going somewhere I've truly never been before. So it's I can't pick a favorite. I mean, Journey probably changed my life more than any other project. It was such a big success compared to what any of us were expecting, and all the awards and everything were kind of surreal. And the fact that the music gets played all the time by orchestras all over the world constantly is also just so surreal to me. So I'm, of course, very proud of that experience, but most proud, I honestly don't know. My goal is that what I do tomorrow makes what I did yesterday seem only okay. You know, I want to make tomorrow's work the best I've ever done. So I can't pick a favorite, because that should theoretically mean my favorite or my most proud is whatever I finished last, because the next one is now going to be even better. But who knows? I honestly can't say. Sorry. You were right, though. It's a tough question.
There's nothing to sorry for. It's really interesting answer, and thank you for your answers.